When you walk through the grand galleries of Europe's most prestigious museums, you're told you're witnessing the complete visual record of Western civilization. The Louvre, the Hermitage, the National Gallery, the Prado. Millions of visitors each year file past gilded frames containing the faces of kings and emperors, generals and statesmen, the men who supposedly shaped history through conquest and decree. The walls drip with masculine power, battle scenes, coronation ceremonies, treaties signed by hands heavy with signet rings. But something is missing, something so obvious that once you notice it, you'll never be able to walk through a museum the same way again. Where are the women? Not the decorative consorts positioned slightly behind their husbands, not the symbolic Madonnas or mythological figures serving as allegory. Where are the ruling queens, the empresses who held power in their own right, the women whose signatures appeared on treaties, whose armies marched under their command, whose decisions shaped the borders of nations? The official explanation is simple. History was patriarchal. Women rarely held power. When they did, they were exceptions, anomalies, footnotes in a narrative written by and for men. We're told to accept the absence as natural, inevitable, a reflection of how things simply were. But I started asking a question that wouldn't leave me alone. What if the absence isn't natural? What if it's manufactured? What if there was an entire category of female rulers systematically erased from the historical record, and the proof of their existence survives in the very portraits that were supposed to disappear? I began this investigation the way I begin most of my research, by looking at what doesn't fit, by examining the margins, the footnotes, the images that historians prefer not to discuss. And what I found in the portrait archives of Europe and beyond suggests something far more disturbing than simple patriarchal oversight. It suggests deliberate erasure on a continental scale. Let me take you to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, one of the largest art collections in the world. Over 3 million items, thousands of portraits spanning 5 centuries of European and Russian history. The official catalogues are meticulous, documenting provenance, artist attribution, restoration history. But buried in the reserve collections, in the rooms not open to public viewing, there exist portraits that don't appear in any catalogue. Women in elaborate ceremonial dress, women wearing crowns and imperial regalia, women positioned in poses of authority, seated on thrones, holding orbs and scepters, surrounded by symbols of sovereign power, women whose names have been removed from the frames. I spent 3 years tracking references to these portraits through auction records, private collection inventories, and the correspondence of 19th century art dealers. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Sometime between 1780 and 1850, hundreds of portraits depicting female rulers underwent systematic reclassification. Queens became noble ladies, empresses became allegorical figures, sovereign women holding symbols of actual political power became artistic fantasies or costume pieces. The women didn't disappear from the paintings. Their identities disappeared from the records. Consider what this means. You can stand before a portrait of a woman wearing a crown, seated on a throne, holding the instruments of royal authority, and the museum placard will tell you she's unknown noblewoman, circa 1720, or allegorical figure representing sovereignty. The image shows you a queen. The documentation tells you she doesn't exist, and this pattern repeats across every major collection in Europe. The question is why? To understand what was erased, we first need to understand what supposedly existed. Official history acknowledges certain powerful women: Catherine the Great of Russia, Maria Theresa of Austria, Elizabeth I of England. These names appear in textbooks, their portraits prominently displayed, their reigns extensively documented. But here's what's strange. These acknowledged female rulers are presented as extraordinary exceptions, anomalies produced by unusual circumstances, accidents of succession that placed women on thrones designed for men. We're told their power was controversial, contested, constantly requiring justification. Yet the portrait evidence suggests something entirely different. The portrait evidence suggests that female sovereignty wasn't exceptional at all. It was systematic. In the archives of the Austrian National Library, I found references to a collection of portraits commissioned in 1695 depicting the reigning queens of the European Confederation. Not singular queens, queens, plural, multiple women simultaneously holding sovereign power across what the document calls the Confederation. This collection was catalogued, inventoried, and then apparently dispersed sometime in the late 18th century. Individual portraits from the set appear sporadically in auction records throughout the 1800s, each time with different attributions, different supposed subjects, different interpretive frameworks designed to obscure what they originally represented. The original catalogue describing them as reigning queens was filed among documents later classified as historical curiosities of doubtful provenance. But the portraits themselves survive, and they show women of extraordinary authority. Let me describe what these portraits actually depict, because the visual evidence contradicts everything we're told about the limited role of women in pre-modern governance. The first category I call the sovereign portraits. These show women in full imperial regalia, not as consorts or ceremonial figures, but as primary holders of power. The composition is unmistakable to anyone familiar with royal portraiture conventions. The subject is centered, the throne is prominent, the crown sits on her head, not beside her or held by attendants. The orb and scepter rest in her hands, not displayed on cushions nearby. These are not portraits of queens who ruled through or beside their husbands. These are portraits of women who ruled. In one particularly striking example, currently held in a private collection in Vienna, a woman in her middle years sits before a map displaying territories that don't match any modern nation. She wears a crown of a style I've never seen in official royal regalia collections. Her left hand rests on a document bearing seals from multiple kingdoms. Her right hand holds what appears to be a ceremonial sword. The painting's current attribution: unknown artist, allegorical portrait of justice, possibly 18th century. But the map behind her isn't allegorical. The territories are specific, the boundaries are precise, and the seals on the document she's signing are real seals, not symbolic representations. Someone went to extraordinary effort to document this woman's authority over specific places, and then someone else went to equal effort to pretend the portrait meant nothing at all. The second category I call the administrative portraits. These depict women engaged in the actual work of governance, not symbolic representations of virtue or wisdom, but practical documentation of women performing executive functions. I found one remarkable example in a Dutch private collection. So, a woman sits at a desk covered with correspondence. Naval charts spread before her. A globe shows shipping routes. Through the window behind her, a harbor fills with merchant vessels. She wears no crown, but her clothing indicates extreme wealth and status. The papers on her desk bear official seals. This is a portrait of a woman running a commercial empire, not a trading company director's wife, not an allegorical figure, a woman actively managing international trade. The portrait is labeled Interior Scene with Woman at Desk, Unknown Artist, circa 1680. Interior scene, as if the specific details of shipping charts, naval correspondence, and merchant fleets are merely decorative elements. The third category is perhaps the most disturbing. I call them the erased queens. The erased queens are portraits that show clear evidence of alteration. Crowns painted over with elaborate hairstyles, scepters transformed into fans or flowers, thrones modified to appear as ordinary chairs, royal backgrounds replaced with domestic interiors. I worked with a team of art restoration specialists who agreed to examine several suspect portraits using infrared reflectography and X-ray imaging. What they found confirmed my suspicions. Beneath the surface of paintings currently displayed as noble portraits or society ladies, earlier compositions showed entirely different images: women wearing crowns, women holding instruments of power, women positioned in compositions indicating sovereign authority. The modifications weren't subtle repairs or later additions. They were systematic transformations designed to change the fundamental meaning of the images. Someone wanted these women to stop looking like rulers. One portrait currently displayed in a regional French museum as Portrait of a Lady circa 1750 revealed an extraordinary history under technical examination. The original composition, painted roughly 50 years earlier than the attributed date, showed a woman in full coronation regalia. The crown was later painted over with an elaborate wig. The throne was modified to appear as a drawing room chair. The orb in her hand was transformed into a piece of fruit. A ruling queen became a lady eating an apple. When I asked the museum about this discovery, the official response was that earlier compositions often served as base layers for later portraits. And the changes simply reflected evolving artistic preferences. No acknowledgement that the changes systematically removed every element indicating sovereign power. No curiosity about why someone would paint over a completed royal portrait to make the subject look less important. The institutional indifference was complete. But here is where the investigation took a turn that I still struggle to process. When I began mapping the geographic distribution of these altered and misattributed portraits, expecting to find them clustered in a few collections or regions, I discovered instead that they appear everywhere, not just in Europe, not just in former colonial territories, everywhere. I found references to similar portrait alterations in Russian collections, Prussian archives, Spanish palace inventories, Portuguese colonial records, Austrian libraries, Swedish museums, and Ottoman imperial holdings. The same pattern: women in positions of authority depicted, then modified, then reclassified as something other than what they clearly represented. The scale is global. In the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, I located auction records from the 1850s describing the sale of imperial portraits from the Eastern Territories, subject female, sovereignty depicted. The auction catalogue notes that several purchasers requested modification to remove contentious political elements before delivery. Remove contentious political elements from portraits of women. In Russian Orthodox Church archives, I found inventories from the early 18th century listing icons depicting the Holy Empress of the Eastern lands alongside traditional religious figures. So these icons were later removed from churches during the standardization campaigns of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The official reason given was theological irregularity, but the descriptions suggest these weren't standard religious images at all. They were portraits of ruling women incorporated into ecclesiastical art, women whose authority was considered sacred enough to appear alongside saints. And then those images were removed, reclassified, and forgotten. The global coordination of this erasure presents a problem for conventional historical explanation. How did museums in France, churches in Russia, palaces in Portugal, and archives in Istanbul all simultaneously decide that portraits of powerful women needed to be modified, reclassified, or hidden? Convergent evolution doesn't produce identical responses across disconnected institutions and cultures. It doesn't explain why the same specific modifications, crowns becoming wigs, thrones becoming chairs, scepters becoming fans, appear in collections that supposedly had no contact with each other. It suggests coordination. It suggests policy. It suggests someone decided these women needed to disappear from visual memory. The question that haunts me isn't just who these women were, it's why they had to be erased. And that's where the Tartarian connection becomes impossible to ignore. We've documented in previous investigations the evidence for a sophisticated civilization that existed before the accepted historical timeline. The architectural anomalies, the buried first floors, the infrastructure too advanced for its supposed era. The global patterns that suggest centralized coordination across regions that officially had no contact. What if that civilization wasn't patriarchal? What if the empire we've been calling Tartaria was ruled wholly or partially by women? The evidence points in this direction with disturbing consistency. Consider the architectural features we've already documented: the massive doorways and oversized proportions, the sophisticated environmental systems, the acoustic chambers and resonance architecture, the free energy technology encoded in building design. Now consider what kind of society builds such things. Not the martial, conquest-driven civilizations that dominate official history. Not empires built on male violence and territorial expansion. The Tartarian infrastructure suggests a society focused on harmony, on environmental integration, on sustainable technology. These are not historically masculine priorities. These are priorities that have been consistently associated with feminine governance throughout human cultural memory. What if the reason Tartaria had to be erased wasn't just its technological advancement? What if it had to be erased because its power structure contradicted everything the post-reset world wanted people to believe about the natural order of human society? What if the most dangerous thing about Tartaria was that women ruled it? The portrait evidence supports this hypothesis in ways I didn't expect when I began this investigation. Among the most significant discoveries were what I call the ceremonial group portraits. These are large-scale paintings depicting multiple figures in formal arrangements, the kind of images commissioned to document important occasions, alliances, treaties, transfers of power. In official royal collections, such portraits invariably show men: kings signing treaties, generals celebrating victories, statesmen negotiating borders. Women appear, if at all, as peripheral figures, decorative presences adding legitimacy or beauty to masculine proceedings. But in the hidden archives and private collections, I found group portraits that tell an entirely different story. One remarkable image, photographed in the 1920s before its collection was dispersed and current location unknown, shows 12 women seated around a circular table. Each wears distinct regalia, suggesting different territories or kingdoms. Each holds documents. The table before them displays a map of what appears to be the Eurasian continent, but with borders and divisions that don't match any historical atlas. The composition is unmistakably a summit portrait, a documentation of rulers meeting to negotiate or coordinate, 12 sovereign women deciding the fate of a continent. The photograph's caption, written by the collector who owned the image before the dispersal, reads simply, "The Council of Queens, original provenance unknown, possibly 17th century, possibly earlier. The Council of Queens, not a council advising queens, a council of queens, women who held power meeting as equals to exercise that power collectively." Where is this painting now? The collector's archive was sold in 1937. The painting itself disappears from records after 1941. It may have been destroyed in the war. It may sit in a private collection, its significance unrecognized. It may have been deliberately hidden, but the photograph survives, and it shows what the official historical record refuses to acknowledge. Another category of evidence I call the succession portraits. In traditional European royal portraiture, succession is depicted through images of kings passing power to sons or male heirs. The dying monarch reaches toward his successor. The crown transfers from one male head to another, masculine power reproducing itself through generations. But I found a collection of portraits, currently scattered across multiple European museums and all misidentified as various unrelated subjects, that when assembled chronologically show something entirely different. They show power transferring from queen to queen. The first image shows an elderly woman in royal regalia, her hand extended toward a younger woman wearing a smaller crown. The second shows the younger woman now fully crowned, with a child beside her, female. The third shows that child grown, receiving the crown from her mother. The fourth continues the pattern. 4 generations of female sovereignty, 4 queens passing power to queens. Each of these paintings is currently displayed with a different attribution. The first is labeled as allegorical portrait of wisdom and youth. The second as unknown noble woman with attendant. The third as portrait of a lady with daughter. The fourth as genre scene, woman in historic costume. None acknowledge the obvious sequence. None recognize the succession. But when you place them side by side, when you examine the consistent artistic style, the matching frame dimensions, the complementary compositional elements, the sequence is undeniable. These were commissioned as a set. They document a royal line, a female royal line. The erasure of these women from historical memory required more than simply hiding portraits in reserve collections or misidentifying their subjects. It required rewriting the very structure of how we understand power. Think about how monarchy is explained in standard historical education, the divine right of kings, the masculine succession, the patrilineal transfer of authority. We're taught to see female rulers as exceptions, as anomalies produced by failures in the male line, as problems to be solved through marriage to appropriate males who could restore natural order. But what if this entire framework is the lie? What if it's the cover story created to explain why there are no queens after the queens were removed? Consider how thoroughly the erasure penetrated every level of historical documentation. In genealogical records, I found family trees that simply skipped generations of women, daughters who inherited power, represented as sisters or cousins of male relatives who actually ruled, queens who reigned for decades compressed into brief regencies until a male heir came of age. Male heirs who sometimes appear to have been invented for the purpose. In diplomatic archives, I found treaties bearing signatures that historians can't identify. Women's names appearing on documents of state authority, consistently explained away as errors, scribal additions, or symbolic signatures without political meaning. In church records, I found coronation ceremonies documented for women who don't appear in any royal succession. Queens crowned by archbishops, anointed with holy oil, invested with sacred authority, but somehow missing from every official king list. The documents exist. The evidence of female sovereignty appears throughout the archive. But the interpretive framework supplied by official history makes it invisible. We're trained not to see what's in front of us. The chronology of the erasure corresponds precisely with what we've documented in other investigations. The major alterations to royal portraits begin appearing in records from the late 18th century and accelerate dramatically through the mid-19th century. This is the same window when asylum construction exploded across the globe. The same window when the mudflood evidence suggests catastrophic disruption. The same window when giants disappear from the photographic record. The same window when the architectural style we associate with Tartaria was supposedly rebuilt or restored by civilizations that couldn't have constructed it. Everything points to the same period. Everything suggests the same reset, and the portraits provide a specific mechanism for understanding what the reset required. If you're replacing one civilization with another, if you're installing a new power structure on the ruins of an old one, you don't just bury the buildings, you don't just institutionalize the witnesses, you also erase the icons, the images, the visual memory of who held power before. You take portraits of queens and turn them into portraits of nobody. You take images of female sovereignty and relabel them as allegory and costume pieces, and unknown noble women. You make the past literally unrecognizable to those who come after. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming. I'm not saying every powerful woman in history was erased. Some survived in the record, either because their erasure was incomplete or because they served useful purposes for the new narrative. Catherine the Great remained visible because she could be portrayed as an exception, a unique figure whose power derived from masculine-coded qualities like military conquest and sexual dominance. I'm not saying there was a single conspiracy meeting setting where someone decided to eliminate all evidence of female rule. The erasure was likely a process, not an event, occurring over decades as the new civilization established itself and refined its preferred version of history. What I am saying is that the portrait evidence reveals systematic patterns that can't be explained by accident or simple neglect. Too many portraits modified in the same specific ways. Too many women in positions of authority reclassified as decorative figures. Too much coordination across institutions and borders that supposedly weren't coordinating. And I'm saying that these patterns connect to the larger questions we've been exploring throughout this series. If Tartaria existed, if an advanced civilization preceded the one we know, if a global reset occurred sometime in the 18th or 19th century, then the erasure of that civilization's rulers makes perfect sense. You can't leave the queens visible while claiming the kingdom never existed. The survival of the portraits, even in their modified and misidentified forms, represents a failure of the erasure. Someone should have destroyed them. Someone should have burned the canvases and melted down the frames and left nothing for future generations to question. But they didn't. Perhaps the portraits were too valuable as artistic objects to destroy. Perhaps the modification strategy seemed sufficient, turning queens into nobody, removing the political meaning while preserving the aesthetic value. Perhaps some of those responsible for the erasure wanted the evidence to survive, wanted future generations to have the possibility of discovery, or perhaps the portraits simply slipped through. In the chaos of whatever happened during the reset period, and the comprehensive destruction that should have occurred never did, some images survived in attics and basements and private collections, emerging decades later into a world that no longer remembered what they represented. Whatever the reason, the portraits exist, and they show us women who ruled. I want to describe one more discovery because it connects the portrait evidence to the broader investigation in ways that I still find overwhelming. In a private collection in Bavaria, I was shown a portrait that the owners had inherited from ancestors who served in the court of a minor German principality. The family had possessed the image for at least 8 generations, always kept in a locked room, never displayed publicly. The portrait shows a woman of perhaps 40 years. She wears a crown that combines elements I've never seen together, a style that doesn't match any recognized royal tradition. Her clothing incorporates symbols that appear across Tartarian architecture, the distinctive geometric patterns, the specific floral motifs, the atmospheric elements that we've associated with the lost civilization's aesthetic vocabulary. Behind her, through a window, a city spreads out to the horizon, but it's not a city I recognize. The architecture is unmistakably Tartarian, domed structures with spires, buildings of impossible scale, streets laid out with mathematical precision, the atmospheric energy technology visible in the structure's design. She ruled this city. The composition makes that undeniable. She sits in the foreground as its sovereign. The city behind her is her domain, and she looks directly at the viewer with an expression I can only describe as knowing. As if she understood that future generations would see this image, as if she knew the erasure was coming, as if she left this portrait as a message. I'm still here. I existed. You can't erase what you don't understand. The family who showed me this portrait spoke of an old tradition passed down with the image. They were told never to modify it, never to clean it improperly, never to let it leave the family, and never to tell outsiders what it represented. They called her the last queen. The last queen of what? The family tradition didn't say. But when I looked at the Tartarian city spreading out behind her, I understood what the title meant. She was among the final rulers of a civilization that was about to be erased from human memory. The implications of this evidence extend beyond historical curiosity. They challenge fundamental assumptions about human society and political organization. We're told that patriarchy is natural, that male dominance is the default state of human civilization, that women's exclusion from power reflects biological or divine ordering. We're told that the few female rulers who appear in history are exceptions, that their power was always contingent, contested, temporary. But what if patriarchy isn't natural at all? What if it's constructed? What if the world we inherit, the world where men rule and women serve, was deliberately built on the ruins of something very different? The portraits suggest a world where female sovereignty wasn't exceptional, where queens ruled kingdoms and empresses governed continents, where power transferred from mother to daughter across generations, where women sat in council deciding the fate of nations. That world had to be destroyed twice, once physically through whatever catastrophe ended the Tartarian civilization, and once symbolically through the systematic erasure of every image, every document, every memory of women who held power. The buildings were buried, the technology was lost, the giants disappeared, and the queens were painted over, turned into nobody, their crowns becoming wigs and their thrones becoming chairs, and their power becoming invisible. I've started to recognize the Tartarian queens in unexpected places. Once you know what to look for, once you understand the specific modifications that transformed rulers into decorative figures, you begin to see them everywhere, in regional museums with minimal budgets for proper art historical research, in private collections inherited and never examined, in church basements and aristocratic attics and auction lots that pass without comment. They're still here, hanging on walls, labeled as things they're not, their power waiting to be recognized by anyone willing to see it. A woman holding a fan that, under infrared imaging, reveals itself as a scepter. A lady seated in a drawing room that was originally a throne room. A noble woman in elaborate dress that was once coronation regalia. An allegorical figure representing an ideal that was actually a portrait of a specific queen ruling a specific kingdom at a specific moment in history. The erasure wasn't complete. It couldn't be complete. The evidence was too abundant, too widely distributed, too embedded in collections across the globe. The best they could do was modify it, misidentify it, train us not to see what remained visible. But we can learn to see again. The official history tells us we're looking at anonymous noble women and allegorical figures and artistic fantasies. The portraits themselves tell us something different. They tell us that women ruled. They tell us that the world before the reset was organized along principles fundamentally different from the world we inherited. They tell us that the greatest lie isn't just the erased architecture or the buried cities or the lost technology. The greatest lie is the idea that male dominance is natural, inevitable, the way things have always been. It wasn't always this way. The portraits prove it. Women wore crowns. Women held scepters. Women signed treaties and commanded armies and governed civilizations. And when that world ended, whether through catastrophe or conquest or reset, the most dangerous evidence wasn't the buildings or the machines or the maps showing territories that no longer exist. The most dangerous evidence was the faces of the women who ruled. Because you can attribute a building to a different era. You can explain away technology as misidentified or misunderstood. You can label a map as allegorical or speculative. But you can't look at a portrait of a queen sitting on a throne wearing a crown and holding a scepter and claim she doesn't represent exactly what she obviously represents, unless you change the portrait, unless you paint over the crown, unless you transform the throne into an ordinary chair, unless you make the queen into nobody at all. What else don't we know about the world before the reset? We've documented the buried cities, the impossible architecture, the evidence of advanced technology, the giants who disappeared from the photographic record, the asylums built to contain witnesses. Now add to that list the queens who were erased from visual memory, not one or two exceptional women, not anomalies produced by unusual circumstances. Queens, plural, many queens, queens ruling across continents, queens passing power to daughters, queens meeting in council to govern a civilization, and all of it painted over, misidentified, hidden in plain sight in the museums where millions of visitors walk past every year, never knowing they're looking at evidence of a world deliberately erased from human memory. The official history tells us we're seeing allegorical figures and unknown noble women and artistic fantasies. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. The crowns are there, beneath the wigs. The thrones are there, beneath the chairs. The queens are there, beneath the nobody, and they're waiting to be recognized. I want to address a possible objection. Why would anyone go to such extraordinary lengths to erase evidence of female rule? What possible threat could portraits of dead queens pose to the post-reset civilization? The answer lies in understanding what the portraits represent beyond their individual subjects. Every portrait of a ruling queen is evidence that female sovereignty is possible. Every image of a woman wearing a crown is proof that patriarchy isn't natural or inevitable. Every picture of a female ruler contradicts the fundamental assumptions on which the post-reset world was built. If people knew that women once ruled, so they might believe that women could rule again. If people saw evidence that matriarchal or egalitarian societies existed, they might question the structures of male dominance that organize their own world. If the portraits survived intact, with their crowns and thrones and scepters clearly visible, they would function as permanent challenges to the legitimacy of patriarchal power. So they had to be modified, not destroyed, because destruction might itself become evidence that something was being hidden, but transformed, changed enough that their original meaning became invisible, while their existence as aesthetic objects continued. The modification strategy is actually more effective than destruction. A burned painting creates questions about what was burned. A modified painting creates no questions at all. It simply sits on the wall, labeled as something innocuous, its real meaning invisible to anyone who doesn't know how to look. The erasure succeeded precisely because it was incomplete. The portraits survived, but their power was neutralized. The queens remained visible, but their identity as queens was erased. Until now, I've been tracking references to a specific document that supposedly contains a master list of the portrait modifications, a catalogue created by those responsible for the erasure, documenting which images were changed, how they were changed, and what they originally depicted. The existence of such a document makes sense. A coordinated effort across multiple countries and institutions would require documentation. Someone had to keep track of which portraits had been addressed and which still required attention. References to this catalogue appear in the private correspondence of several 19th-century art dealers and collectors. They call it various names: the Venus Index in one letter, the Catalogue of Corrections in another, the Queen List in a third. The references describe a systematic inventory of portraits depicting women in positions of authority, with instructions for modification or reclassification. Some letters mention specific paintings and describe what changes were recommended. Others reference the catalogue's organization, apparently sorted by region and current collection location. I haven't found the catalogue itself. It may have been destroyed once the modifications were complete. It may sit in a private archive, its significance unrecognized. It may be held by descendants of those who created it, and passed down as a family secret too dangerous to reveal. But if it exists, if it could be found, it would provide definitive proof of the coordinated erasure. It would list the queens by name. It would identify which portraits showed which rulers. It would reverse the modifications and restore the identities of the women who were turned into nobody. I continue to search for it. The references are too consistent to be fabricated. The catalogue existed. Whether it still exists is another question. In the absence of the master catalogue, we must reconstruct the truth portrait by portrait. Every modified painting examined under infrared reveals a fragment of the erased past. Every misidentified queen, properly recognized, restores a piece of the hidden history. So every connection drawn between scattered portraits reassembles the shattered visual record of female sovereignty. This work is happening. Small groups of researchers, art historians willing to question official attributions, private collectors examining their inherited treasures with new eyes. The reconstruction is slow, fragmentary, constantly challenged by institutional resistance. But it's happening, and what's emerging contradicts everything we've been taught about the natural order of human society. Women ruled, not as exceptions, not as anomalies, not as temporary placeholders waiting for proper male authority to be restored. Women ruled as queens and empresses and sovereign authorities in their own right. Women passed crowns to daughters and built dynasties and governed civilizations. Women sat in council and made treaties and decided the fates of nations. And when that world ended, when the reset came, when the new civilization rose on the buried foundations of the old, the most essential task wasn't rebuilding cities or restoring technology. The most essential task was erasing the memory of female power, because cities can be rebuilt and technology rediscovered. But once people forget that women can rule, that forgetting shapes everything that comes after. The portraits are still there, hanging in museums and private collections across the world, waiting. Some show their modifications obviously, crowns poorly disguised as elaborate hair, thrones visible beneath the painted-over chairs. Others hide their secrets deeper, requiring technical analysis to reveal what lies beneath. But they all share the same truth. They all show women who ruled. They all represent a past that was supposed to be erased but wasn't quite. Not completely, not thoroughly enough. And every time someone looks at one of these portraits and recognizes what it really shows, the erasure becomes a little less complete. Every queen identified is a crack in the wall of forgetting. Every crown restored is an act of historical revolution. Every throne made visible again is proof that the lie isn't absolute, that the truth survives, that the past wasn't completely destroyed. I started this investigation looking for evidence. What I found was something more. I found the faces of the women who ruled the world before the reset. I found the deliberate, coordinated effort to erase them from human memory. I found the incomplete success of that effort, the evidence that survived, the portraits that remained, the queens who refused to completely disappear. And I found the implications of that survival. If women ruled before, women can rule again. If matriarchal or egalitarian power structures existed, they can exist again. If the patriarchy we inherited isn't natural but constructed, it can be deconstructed. The portraits aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of possibility. They're proof that the world we know isn't the only world there ever was. They're windows into a past where human society organized itself around different principles. And maybe that's the real reason they had to be erased. Not because dead queens threaten current power structures directly, but because the memory of their existence threatens the ideology that justifies those structures. If people knew that women once ruled, They might start asking why women don't rule now. If people saw the portraits as they were originally painted, crowns and thrones and scepters intact, they might start questioning the assumptions that make current arrangements seem natural and inevitable. The queens had to disappear because their existence was an argument that power doesn't naturally belong to men, an argument that patriarchy is a choice, not a fate, an argument that the world can be organized differently than it is. So what do we do with this knowledge? We look more carefully, we question official attributions, we examine portraits with suspicious modifications, we trace provenance and catalogue histories and auction records, we build the evidence base, portrait by portrait, queen by queen, we share what we find, despite institutional resistance and academic dismissal. We remember the women who ruled, even though we were supposed to forget them, because the portraits are still there, the evidence survives, the erasure wasn't complete, and once you see the queens beneath the anonymous noblewomen, once you see the crowns beneath the elaborate wigs, once you see the thrones beneath the drawing room chairs, you understand what was taken from us. Not just historical knowledge, not just accurate understanding of the past. What was taken was possibility, the knowledge that human society can organize itself differently, the proof that female sovereignty isn't an anomaly but a tradition. The portraits preserve that possibility, even modified, even misidentified, even labeled as things they're not. The queens are still there, waiting to be recognized. And their recognition changes everything. I'll close with the image that started this investigation, a portrait I saw in a minor regional museum during research for an unrelated project. A woman in elaborate dress, labeled simply unknown, circa 1730. Something about the composition bothered me. The pose was too formal, too centered, too authoritative for a mere society portrait. I looked more closely at her dress. Beneath the painted-over fabric, I could see the original outline of ceremonial robes. Her right hand, positioned as if holding a fan, showed a faint shadow that suggested something longer, straighter, heavier, a scepter. Her chair, an ordinary drawing room piece according to the current painting, showed traces of a more elaborate original. Higher back, armrests carved with symbols, the unmistakable lines of a throne, and on her head, beneath the elaborate wig that 18th century fashion supposedly demanded, the faint outline of what the wig was painted to hide, a crown. She looked at me across 3 centuries of deliberate forgetting. She had been a queen. Someone had painted over her authority. Someone had transformed her from sovereign to nobody. Someone had tried to erase her from historical memory. They failed. She was still there, still visible to anyone willing to look closely enough, still wearing her crown beneath the wig, still holding her scepter beneath the fan, still sitting on her throne beneath the chair, still a queen, still waiting to be recognized. They erased the Tartarian queens from history. The portraits prove they existed, and every portrait restored is a queen remembered. Every queen remembered is a crack in the wall of lies. Every crack lets more light through, until finally the whole construction collapses, and we see clearly what was hidden for so long. Women ruled, the portraits prove it, and now we know.